Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Friday, October 10th, day 735 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with a briefer briefing from our U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid ahead of our regularly scheduled Friday focus with Lazar Berman. So, Jacob, thank you for joining me for, I think, it's your fourth time, unprecedented fourth time this week.
Unprecedented. Good to be with you again, Amanda.
Thanks so much. And Jacob will give us an update on the very early morning government vote that led to the current ceasefire. But before that, an IDF reservist soldier was killed in a Hamas sniper attack in Gaza City Thursday afternoon. We learned this morning. The slain soldier is named as Sergeant First Class Michael Mordechai Nachmani, who is 26, a technology and maintenance corps soldier in the 614th Command Engineering Battalion. He is from Dimona. The sniper attack came after Israeli and Hamas negotiators signed a deal in Egypt to secure the release of all the hostages held by the terror group in Gaza, and a ceasefire as part of the deal had not yet taken effect when the attack was carried out. So very early this morning, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet voted in favor of a Gaza ceasefire deal that will see the hostages freed in exchange for Palestinian security prisoners and a halt to the fighting. This vote came despite vocal objections from the far-right coalition partners. So, Jacob, fill us in on, first of all, on who voted for what.
Sure. So it wasn't a total surprise who voted against this. Also wasn't surprised that it passed. But those who refused to get behind it were ministers from the two far-right parties, Otzma Yehudit, which is Itamar Ben-Gvir's party, the National Security Minister, and then the Religious Zionism Party of Bezalel Smotrich. Notably, one of Smotrich's ministers, Ophir Sofer, who's also in the Religious Zionism Party, did back the plan. But the rest, I think there were 5 or 6 ministers from those two far-right parties that voted against. But notably, as we talked about a day earlier, neither party is saying that they're willing to collapse the government yet. They just reiterated their feeling that if this deal does not lead to Hamas being disarmed, that then they will decide to collapse the coalition. So kind of trying to keep their seats warm for now, not looking to go anywhere.
And in fact, the Knesset is ostensibly on break until October 19th, so they literally cannot collapse the government until the Knesset reassembles. Let's talk about the status of the ceasefire. And the IDF is now expected to withdraw to new lines inside of the Gaza Strip, 72 hours after which Hamas will release all the hostages. Has this already begun, Jacob? Do you know?
The withdrawal has begun. There's been footage even starting as early as Thursday during the afternoon. You saw some tanks pulling back to positions in Gaza that I guess will bring Israel to what's now I think is going to be called a yellow line, where they're going to still maintain control of 54% of Gaza, so a majority of the Strip. But that withdrawal has started to happen. At the same time, there's also been reports of continued airstrikes since the cabinet vote was finished, strikes either by air or also tank fire. I assume that's something that we might have to get used to as well, and obviously civilians in Gaza might have to get used to as well. I think this kind of framework is going to be very touch and go, and also will be similar to the Lebanon framework, where even though there is a ceasefire in place since November, you've had continued strikes by Israel that it says are targeting Hezbollah fighters or violations of what it says are the ceasefire. I wouldn't be surprised if we see similar dynamic play out in Gaza. It is something, on the other hand, that the Hamas has been adamant in trying to avoid. And it'll be interesting to see if these strikes get picked up by Trump or noticed by Trump. So far, it hasn't. Even in the past few days, if you recall, a few days ago, when Trump said that he had ordered Israel to stop carrying out airstrikes as the deal was progressing, there were still subsequent strikes. Israel said it was doing it to target Hamas fighters who were posing a threat. But again, this is just a very, very touch and go situation that I think will continue until the hostages are released, and I think probably afterwards.
So, listeners, if you are intrigued by this idea of the Lebanon model, please check out our Friday focus immediately following Jacob's briefer briefing. Now, a military team from the US of 200 people will be deployed in the Middle East to quote unquote oversee the Gaza ceasefire between Israel and Hamas after this peace deal was brokered. So, Jacob, what does this mean to you? This is very new.
So the concept actually was originally crafted by the Biden administration to have U.S. forces be based in Egypt and kind of running a command and control center that's trying to make sure that everything is being implemented properly. And this is one of the ideas that Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff took from, I guess, the Biden administration as they advanced this idea. And they're going to be using soldiers from CENTCOM, 200 of them they haven't decided or they haven't announced where they'll be based. There was a comment from White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt saying that they would be in Israel. But my understanding is that Egypt will once again be a more practical solution, given that there were two senior U.S. officials who were briefing reporters on Thursday about this plan to have this command center. And they said that it's going to include cooperation with Qatar and with Egypt and with Turkey. And given that Qatar doesn't have formal diplomatic relations, I have a hard time seeing Qatari soldiers going or even commanders going in and participating in a command center in Israel. And also given the very cool ties that Israel currently has with Turkey, that also makes it difficult to imagine that they would be sending their own soldiers to Israel. But that for now, that is what the administration is saying, is that they will be in the region. I think there'll be more clarity of where they'll be later. But what they were very adamant about saying was that this will not be something that U.S. soldiers will not be going into Gaza. This will be coordination from afar, and it will be other countries that will be sending troops that will be part of this international stabilization force, which is something that I guess this command center of U.S. troops from CENTCOM will actually be helping to stand up. They haven't really announced which countries will be sending troops. Trump dodged a question about this on Thursday. My understanding is Indonesia is one of the countries, working to confirm a second country as well that has already committed. But I think the U.S. is trying to keep this issue under wraps and also hasn't gotten finalized commitments from countries yet. I think they're first focused on the hostage issue and getting that over the finish line, which will have to take place either on Monday or Tuesday, President Trump was saying on Thursday. At first, he was a couple days ago or a day ago, he was talking about Monday. But now I think given this 72-hour deadline or just making sure that everything is in order, it might have to be also on Tuesday, according to Trump. But we'll have to see.
Okay, Jacob, thank you so much for this briefer briefing. And of course, listeners, check out our live blog for the latest updates. Jacob, get some rest.
Shabbat Shalom, Amanda.
Shabbat Shalom, Jacob. Please stay tuned for a full episode of The Friday Focus with Lazar Berman. Welcome to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman, in our Jerusalem office. Lazar, thanks for joining me as usual.
Good to be here, but there is nothing usual about this time and this conversation because, of course, it comes after some historic developments.
That is correct. And in fact, many have wondered how we can reconcile between the Sukkot holiday, in which Jews are commanded to feel joy or observe joy, and what's going on in the Gaza Strip right now. And I think we've come to realize that we can. From today on, we can reconcile these two and feel at least some kind of guarded joy. Why is that, Lazar?
Well, I would actually say that the Jewish people have managed to feel multiple things at once throughout history, given our history, but we've also been able to maintain that joy in the face of obviously repeated suffering. So it's something that's kind of in our DNA. But of course, Simchat Torah in the Hebrew calendar was the date 2 years ago, almost exactly, when Hamas invaded southern Israel in that obviously October 7th attack, which was one of the darkest days in Jewish history, certainly in Israeli history. And now it seems that we are on the brink of the release of the final 20 living hostages and 28 other hostages. The bodies, we might not get all of them back, but we'll probably get most of them back. And a diplomatic process that seems to be bringing this war to an end, and to an end on favorable terms for Israel.
Okay, so there are a lot of unknowns still, and we're talking right now about a certainty, or at least a really probable probability, that phase one of the Trump deal will actually take place. And what we're hearing right now is that the hostages, living and dead, as far as we know, should be released by Monday. We are recording ahead of that. Nobody knows. It's not over till it's over. You never know if Hamas has some tricks up its sleeves. But we are going to talk about what made Hamas come to the table and agree to terms right now. We're also going to talk about some scenarios that may be in play for Gaza, that based on different models that we have already with Lebanon and the West Bank. And we're going to do all of that after the break. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. So, Lazar, I think one of the biggest questions that I have is why, after these 2 years, why did Hamas give up on two of its three stances? Its stances were essentially to end the war entirely, and then have Israel withdraw entirely, and then it would give up the hostages. Am I missing something here?
No, you're right. Something has changed dramatically in Hamas's stance. So initially, or for most of the war, you're right. It was a pretty simple equation, at least in the mathematics of it, right? It was, if you want us, this is Hamas speaking, if you want us to give up our strongest asset, and I'm sorry to refer to human beings as an asset, but that's what they were for Hamas, then we need to guarantee our own survival, which means the end of the war and obviously the IDF leaving the Gaza Strip. And that would allow Hamas, of course, to claim victory. It would give a lot of oxygen to the movement itself and to similar movements in the region. And there is no question that this organization, which knows how to withstand repeated rounds of fighting with Israel, even though this was the most damage done, would have been able to at some point figure out a way to reconstitute and pose a new kind of threat to Israel in the future. That was the demand. Israel tried all sorts of ways to knock Hamas off of that demand. Obviously, military pressure was a major one. Diplomatic pressure didn't seem to do too much. But there were times when Hamas decided that it needed a break from the fighting. So, after the initial Israeli move into the Gaza Strip, in late October, it took a month. Hamas said, wow, we didn't expect any sort of ground invasion like this. They got a breather. They released a lot of hostages. It was something like 10 a day. And then in January, they also got a break, but there was also pressure coming from President Trump, and they released another significant batch of hostages. But we got to the point where they knew that they were holding on to their last group of hostages, and that's why they wanted to make sure that they guaranteed their own survival with this group. But what changed? Several things changed. First of all, you had a change in the White House. And even though that's many thousands of miles away, of course, that's very, very critical to what happens here. The Biden administration was broadly supportive of Israel in many ways. There's no question. But when it came to making Hamas feel like it had no choice but to give up, and that it was not going to be able to take advantage of fissures between Jerusalem and Washington to wiggle its way out of it, it just was not credible, because the Biden administration, looking at upcoming elections, would not consistently back Israel. It was always, we're going to back Israel in some way, but we're going to withhold weapons. We're going to try to stop them from going to Rafah. It really became somewhat an incoherent policy. Of course, at the same time, and even recently, you had that from other Western allies as well, especially, the French-led initiative. But once you had Trump come into office, it was very different. There was definitely disagreements with Netanyahu, but he never let those get out of hand. He would say, we disagree. He would say that quite openly, but he would say, but our focus remains getting the hostages out, defeating Hamas, and we're always going to back Israel. And if that was very important as well. And there was also the military pressure. Now, this military campaign, we've spoken about this. I'm quite critical about the way it went. The pace, the lack of operational logic, that happens in long wars. But, there's many things that were obvious to observers that, it needed to change. And it took a long time, but finally this Gideon's Chariots 2 operation was finally putting concerted pressure on Hamas. They realized there was no way they were going to stop the IDF advance. The world wasn't going to come to their aid. The French initiative wasn't going to do anything, and the U.S. wasn't going to stop them this time. So that also pushed them as well. And then you add to the fact that kind of unexpectedly, this failed Doha strike on September 9th actually lined up regional powers, the pro-American ones, and they wanted to meet with Trump, kind of to complain about what Israel did, but Trump actually very masterfully used that as an opportunity to get them on board with this. So you put those three things together, the U.S.-Israel relationship, the military pressure, and the fact that Turkey, Qatar, and Egypt were finally behind this Trump plan. I think Hamas realized that it had to at least give up the hostages and will try to maximize whatever it can from subsequent rounds of negotiations.
Now, there are some, including Israeli journalist Amit Segel, who say that this Gideon Chariots 2 campaign, which was essentially to encircle and take over Gaza City, that this campaign showed Hamas that Israel has finally chosen which direction they want to fight the war, meaning for the entire 2 years, you and I have been talking about how Israel hasn't quite decided whether it wants to defeat Hamas or save the hostages. And according to at least this theory, the campaign to encircle and take over Gaza City, where many of the living hostages are said to be, showed Hamas that Israel is, quote unquote, giving up on the hostages, taking a side. And so therefore, the leverage of the hostages was no longer as powerful as it had been in the past. What do you think about this theory?
Yeah, I think there's a lot there. I mean, it wasn't that, I think Israel, as we can see, was always open to the deal that would free the hostages. It wasn't that they were just going to say, okay, we're going to give up on them and that's that, which I think a lot of other countries would have done. You think about how many countries would risk not winning a war for 20 people? Not a lot. But somehow Israel looks like it's going to be able to pull off both of them, or at least has a very good chance to pull off getting the hostages out and also getting Hamas out of power and disarmed. So yeah, I think there was a lot there, but I think they understood the only way to stop the IDF advance was certainly not through Hamas military power, which they thought they could do at the very beginning of the war. They thought they could stop IDF maneuver, and it wasn't going to be Washington, and it wasn't going to be Paris, and it wasn't going to be the UAE or the Saudis. The only way they were going to stop is to give up the hostages. So the hostages went from their biggest asset to actually something of a liability for them. And now they're going to play with their weapons. How much are they willing to commit to a disarmament and things like that in order to buy some breathing room? And then they'll have to look for some opportunity to kind of put their heads down. And if they survive this, and I'm sure they will in some form, look for an opportunity in the future if the world kind of gets distracted and Israel, makes mistakes, to reconstitute in the future. I think that's the game they're playing now.
Right. I would agree with you. And I would also say that, if Hamas is willing to give up the hostages, then it kind of takes the one final black stain from the group, which is so lauded on the international stage. You mentioned in passing, of course, the French initiative, which was France initiating a recognition of a Palestinian state, and many other countries joined up during this past month to do this. And so in some ways, Palestine, the issue of Palestine, has never been more popular, and yet there's this pesky little thing that, people are being kept hostage and suffering, and there are terrible pictures coming out. Some of these pictures, of course, were used by activist Greta Thunberg as Palestinians, but they were indeed Israelis suffering in the tunnels and malnourished to the point of starvation. But I digress. In any case, yes, getting rid of the liability of the hostages allows Hamas to actually perform on the diplomatic stage a lot better, wouldn't you say?
In some ways, but if indeed there's a lot of anti-Hamas forces coming together, right? So the anti-Hamas forces, besides the U.S. and Israel, Egypt absolutely sees Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood as an enemy, and Hamas as the Palestinian extension of that. And countries like the Saudis and the Emiratis, which the Saudis a long time ago moved away from their terror supporting after 9/11, and the Emiratis certainly want to put a different face forward, and they see religious extremism as getting in the way of everything they stand for. But then you do have so they're not going to be eager to preserve Hamas. The problem is you have this new emerging bloc or axis that seems to be kind of replacing the Iranian one that Israel beat back. And that's Qatar and Turkey, and it seems like Syria. And they are much more ideologically aligned with Hamas. And what makes them problematic is that they have such good relationships with Washington right now. So that might make things a little bit more difficult. And of course, let's not forget the fact that Hamas, maintains power in the West Bank and is popular in many places, even still in Gaza. You see videos of people praising Hamas. Now, we'll have to wait until we get a sense of how much the war has affected their popularity, but who knows? But we know that Hamas is, it did enjoy a very strong base of support in the Gaza Strip. So we'll have to see how much of that survived. But so there are certainly strengths that Hamas has moving forward, but it's very perilous for their organization. And if Israel and its allies play their cards right, we could really get into a place where Hamas's future is very much in doubt.
Okay, let's go to a short break and then we'll discuss how Israel may relate to Hamas in the Gaza Strip in the future. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. So, of course, we have a few models of how the IDF is operating against enemies from basically within and without its borders, meaning we have, of course, the model of Lebanon. And since the ceasefire on November 27th, 2024, the IDF is still operating when it feels it must in Lebanon. And then we have the model of the West Bank, which is, of course, decades and decades of IDF operations inside and outside the West Bank to stamp down the terror there. So let's take the Lebanon model, first of all, Lazar. And I think it has one really important factor in that Hezbollah, the terrorist organization, is inside a sovereign state. So how could that change some things in terms of how we may relate to Hamas in Gaza?
Okay, so when you talk about the Lebanon model, it's usually talking about, I would say, before the very successful Israeli campaign in the fall 2024 that defeated Hezbollah. Didn't destroy it, but definitely defeated it. In which you had, yes, you say a very weak sovereign state, and then you had this organization that was the most powerful entity in the state called Hezbollah, and it decided what happened. And that is very problematic because, you're somewhat limited to what you can do against a state in some ways. And the state itself got Western support and Western investment and Middle Eastern investment at times. But at the same time, it was powerless to stop this Hezbollah threat on Israel's border. And that was very comfortable for Hezbollah. Obviously, the situation has changed there, and the Lebanese state is trying to disarm Hezbollah. We'll see what happens. I'm not that optimistic. But you have this new Lebanon model where Israel is physically inside of Lebanon at 5 points. It does what it wants in Lebanon. It strikes where it wants. And Hezbollah is so cowed that it doesn't respond. So that's not a bad model. Now, if you carry this to Gaza, you could see a situation where you have a Palestinian governing authority. You have Hamas present in some way in some sort of small armed cells. And then Israel carries out airstrikes when it needs to. What gives me pause about this model is that if you think about what Gaza was like before the Hamas takeover in 2007, you had the Palestinian Authority ruling there since the mid-90s. And of course, you had a growing Hamas presence. And even though Israel would go in from the air and even on the ground, it was not able to stop Hamas from going into strength. So that's no guarantee at all. We could think of another model that you brought up, which is the West Bank model. And I think this is kind of the most realistic good scenario for Israel, where we know Hamas exists in the West Bank. It even carries out attacks from time to time. It is unable to do anything major. It can't fire rockets. It doesn't control territory. There is a weak Palestinian Authority that at times that sees itself as an adversary of Hamas and at times actively pursues it. So when it serves Israel's interest, great. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank doesn't really threaten Israel. You might say it's ineffectual. It is hostile to us on the world stage, but it's not carrying out attacks in and of itself. And Israel goes anywhere where it wants to in the West Bank, especially now after October 7th. So any refugee camp, doesn't matter. It can go there and can do what it needs to do, and without really suffering internationally and barely any casualties. That's not a bad model for Gaza either. So you would have this weak Palestinian entity, and nothing gets in the way of Israel doing what it needs to do.
Doesn't it somewhat feel like a containment model, meaning that at any point the pot could boil over again, such as we saw on October 7th?
No, because there's no. Let me try to keep your metaphor here. The pot is not able to be filled in the West Bank because Israel is aggressive and active in making sure that there are no major capabilities gathered or major formations that are created. It remains small and spread out and pursued. Now, there's a third model which seems to be emerging, which seems very good, and I think most Israeli policymakers want this, but I'm going to raise the red flag here because it's problematic. And that is the model envisioned in the Trump plan and other plans as well, which is where there's this international peacekeeping force that will keep Israel safe until such time as there's a strong Palestinian authority, not the Palestinian Authority, but let's say the Palestinian Authority, but some sort of Palestinian group that can keep attacks from happening. Now, that might seem very attractive because, you have the Saudis and the Emiratis, and they're fairly capable militaries, and they're going to keep Israel safe. Well, Israel has a history with these international peacekeeping forces, and the history is not good. So there was a peacekeeping force in the Sinai that Nasser, Egypt's leader, told them to leave, and they left, that it was in the lead up to the 1967 war. More recently, we have UNIFIL, which thankfully is winding down its mission in Lebanon, but they did nothing to stop Hezbollah from getting stronger. It became very clear very early on that Hezbollah said to them, "You're not going into these places. You can drive around on roads if you want, the roads we let you go on," but they didn't do anything to keep Israel safe. They actually got in the way of Israel. So when Israel at times wanted to operate, sometimes you'd have a UNIFIL truck or APC in the way. And then you saw during the war that there was all sorts of problems because Israel had to look out and be careful of where it was striking so it doesn't hit these useless UNIFIL soldiers. And it also leads to diplomatic problems. So, Ireland, we have endless diplomatic problems anyway because they're obsessed with us. But when some of their soldiers, they were saying, were injured or we struck near some of their posts, that adds to the diplomatic problems. And if you look, the Irish have been very involved in these peacekeeping forces around Israel. And some people say that's one of the reasons that there's so much tension between the two sides. So you can imagine what happens if an Emirati or a Saudi soldier is accidentally killed by the IDF. Very big problem. Let's say the Saudis or Emiratis or whoever decide that they don't want, there's too much domestic pressure, so they don't want to let the IDF go on the ground. So they put their vehicles on a road. Do you think an IDF tank is going to shoot at an Emirati vehicle? Obviously not. So there's all sorts of problems that this brings up. We're better off where we have freedom of action, a la the West Bank, and we can go in where we need to. I think that is a much more desirable outcome for Israel.
It's possible that it's a better outcome in terms of security, but I wonder in terms of diplomacy, which is your other hat, of course. And prior to the war, there was a lot of focus on the big O occupation of the West Bank. And of course, there's the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and all sorts of other efforts to get Israel out of the West Bank. So don't you think that by taking that model to the Gaza Strip, it would just perpetuate Israel's bad reputation on the international stage?
No, I think if you think about it, we totally got out of the Gaza Strip. We were still accused of occupation, weren't we? And ultimately, it led to several rounds of fighting, which damaged our image much more than had we stayed and maintained settlements in the Gaza Strip. And then this war, which did untold damage to our reputation. So it's actually our leaving that did more damage than our ongoing operations. An operation in the West Bank doesn't do that much damage, right? The people that are that have nothing better to do than criticize Israel, okay, they'll get excited because we went into into some terrorist camp in the Nablus refugee camp or something like that. But it doesn't drive policy. It doesn't drive headlines. It doesn't really drive people to the streets, or at least it didn't before. We don't know what happens after. So it's these bigger wars when Israel gives up on maintaining its own security, which actually leads to the big problems. So that's the lesson I take from this.
Okay. Lazar, what do you think is going to happen? Meaning, it seems as though at this point that all sides have signed on to the phase 1 of the 20-point Trump plan. But do you really think that we're going to get to a state in which any of the other phases will be enacted even?
It's hard to tell. I didn't think this first phase would come about so quickly even. So I don't want to actually predict anything. But what I can say is what we should look out for. I think, first of all, we see that the decisive element is President Donald Trump. Love him, hate him, whatever. He has a unique brand of diplomacy, which is far more effective than what we saw from the previous White House, than we saw from the Europeans. It works. And you take that apart and ask why it works. But he has personal relationships. People take him seriously. People don't want to cross him. It's very, very effective. And I say that without any reservation. But on the other hand, his attention span is strange. It's hard to predict what he'll focus on. So far he's maintained his attention to this problem, and that has, when you combine that with his effective diplomacy, it has been we've gotten to where we are. If on other issues he's kind of taken his eye off the ball, let's say Russia, Ukraine, he still cares about, but he's not really putting his back into it, then all sorts of things might happen. So if President Trump says, I said this, I meant it, and I'm not going to let the sides wriggle out of it, and I'm going to maintain pressure on Hamas to disarm, and I have ultimata, and things like that, then I do think there's a good chance. But if he gets his Nobel Prize, or decides he doesn't want to do so much foreign policy and tries to get some victories on domestic policy, or gets caught up in midterms, or goes to focus on the Russia-Ukraine war, then I really don't put much hope in the further phases really coming to completion. Also, Witkoff seems like is leaving the White House, so he won't be there. I don't know if Kushner will be involved. Dermer is leaving as well.
Ron Dermer, the Israeli minister,
right, who was the key man a key aide in getting this done for Netanyahu. So you're going to have different players. Obviously, from the Arab states, these people tend to stick around for a long, long time, so they'll still be there. But on the U.S.-Israel side, you're going to have some very different players as well. And you don't know if Netanyahu will be in office, right? He has to have elections within a year, and it might happen even earlier than that. And polls will change after this, because now this will undoubtedly give him a bounce. But the recent polls did not show him being able to make a coalition. So you don't know what's going to happen. So a lot of question marks there. But again, the most important thing is President Trump himself and his own personal attention to this and the effort he puts in.
Okay, and we're meant to get a personal visit from U.S. President Donald Trump on Sunday, is that right? Or Monday?
It looks like it's going to be Saturday night or Sunday morning. The latest I heard, and this could change, be a 3 p.m. Sunday landing at Ben Gurion, ceremony there, something in the Knesset, something at the Kotel, the Western Wall, and an 11 o'clock departure. So it would be pretty lightning. I assume there will be a nice press component there. So we will bring everyone the highlights and behind the scenes. Fear not.
Lazar, thank you so much for joining me for this Friday Focus.
Thank you. And I hope our listeners, who have been with us throughout the war and all these discussions, are feeling some of the relief and the optimism that we are, at least for this holiday period.
For sure. And Shabbat Shalom, Lazar.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Friday Focus. Please join us for another episode next week. This installment was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, Shalom.